Filmmakers are always chasing the cinematic look, and I'm a huge believer that one of the only ways to capture whatever that may be is through practice. So I've taken a scene, or rather a shot, from the new James Bond movie No Time to Die, and I've tried to figure out, can I replicate the look of this scene from my living room? Let's take a look and find out. So this is a scene where Bond is in his reclusive home in Cuba. He lives in sort of this water house, and he's talking to somebody else who's off screen. I just wanted to recreate this one shot because I think it's a pretty good example of the overall look of the film. In this case, I'll show you a little bit of what I did to tweak the color to capture the photographic look, but generally speaking, what I'm after here is the lighting, and sort of breaking down some tips and tricks for what you can do to achieve a similar look to this. Now, disclaimer, my final result's not perfect. I don't think there's any way in which it could be because I don't know all the variables of what kinds of lights they're using, what kinds of diffusion. Obviously, I look a lot like Daniel Craig, but not exactly like him. He just has a little bit more hair than me. All those variables aside, though, I think I got a pretty close result. Okay, right off the bat, one of the most striking elements we can see here is sort of this water background texture, which creates really nice contrast with practical lamps and ultimately the key light on the right side of his face. The director of photography, Linus Sangren, said on the Go Creative Show podcast, Film School 101 is, don't mix color temperatures. Try to match the temperature of your room to whatever's going on outside. This is something that if you're a wedding photographer or videographer, you probably adhere to very closely. Nothing wrong with that. Totally makes sense, and it can produce really great results. I've always been a fan of mixing color temperatures if done right, and the key, I think, is to really separate them from foreground, background, and create color contrast. But one thing that he said that stood out to me was that real life is full of mixed color temperatures. He's always trying to chase something pretty, but ground it in what is actually realistic. Obviously, a shot like this is very blockbustery, it's very cinematic, but I think it's cool that the ideas of what's going on are, what Sandgren could say could happen, or in some cases would happen because it's not unrealistic to have mixed temperatures. Bond lives on this house on the docks, so I can't remember in the film, but there might have been a big window on this side of his face. It's implied that, there's light reflecting off the water and bouncing onto this wall here. If you look at other shots from the reverse angle, there's lamps motivating the key light on his face here. And then, of course, we've got these practical lamps here and here. What I wanted to do when breaking everything down is sort of identify what's going on in the shot, what do I think is being used in terms of lighting. Again, I can't match all the variables, I don't know the exact lights they're using or anything, but I can sort of surmise the basic elements. So first things first, I sort of set the basis of my lighting with the practical lamps. So I had two lamps in the room that actually were placed very similarly in a room that has kind of the same layout as the room in the film. I put each of them on a dimmer so I could just make sure there's not really any highlight going on here. One thing I noticed as I was setting up the lights, I thought initially, I'll just dim them and they'll look like the ones from the movie. But no, this light actually was spilling onto the background. And so what I had to do was bring it out from the wall a little bit to make sure that it was not spilling on the background. And then this light, we actually wanted to spill on the background. And I don't know why, I just couldn't crack why I wasn't getting sort of this nice spill on the bottom. And my wife was like, it needs to go closer to the wall. She helped me through all of this. She's an absolute saint. So she pushed it closer to the wall. And then we were still getting much more spill than we wanted out of the tops of the lamps. We used LED bulbs on dimmers, so heat wasn't really a problem. I didn't have any cinefoil, so I used tinfoil, and it got the job done. And what we were able to do was just sort of wrap it around the back of the bulbs to make sure, again, that we weren't getting any spill out the back, and then also making sure that we weren't getting any spill out the top. And then for basic set deck, we made sure that we framed the shot appropriately, shooting into the corner of the room. This is something that really catches the eye. These sort of instruments on the wall. I have nothing like this in my house, so what I ended up doing was using the tops of two protein shake containers and just thumbtacking them to the wall. I didn't quite line it up perfectly, but it's good enough. I don't have a door here in my living room, so what I ended up doing was just clamping a blanket over my oversized window in the same part of the room, and it did the trick. And then for the key light, I had actually tried to attempt this scene before, and I got kind of disastrous results. I used my 60-watt light dome with an egg crate to sort of separate subject from background, and part of the problem there is that it's daylight temperature only. this room is balanced to the key light, which is 3200 Kelvin. It created a real issue where I was basically having to warm up the face in post, and then, you know, the lights were overly warm, and there was just a lot of post grading, which is not really the point. The point is to show more or less how they shot it. But so with my key light, I felt like, you know, I don't want to make people feel like they have to buy a light dome to capture the shot. So I did an attempt at using a 1x1 panel, some diffusion, some flags, and creating essentially like a big old softbox. Well, I wasn't able to cut enough light, and it was spilling out on the background, and it just didn't have the right shape to it either. It was wrapping my face a little too much. I ended up abandoning that and going back to the light dome, which did a great job separating the subject from the background, allowing for that color contrast between the background and the key light. And to deal with the daylight temperature issue, I put some CTO inside the dome, and I made sure just a little bit of the CTO was peeled down. The color of my skin was just a little too warm compared to the shot here of Daniel Craig. One of the trickiest parts of this shot, and again, I had to do some reshooting, was that it didn't quite occur to me that he's got an eye light here. So you can see here that his eyes right around the pupils are popping with little spots of light, and what that's called is an eye light. It's a light that isn't really affecting the subject or the background per se. Usually it's a small light close to the camera, not directly shined on the subject, and some call it a catch light, because the idea is that the eyes catch it and it just makes them pop. You know, without it, it can be very dark, and in my rendering you can see that unfortunately it didn't quite work. So what I ended up doing when I reshot the shot was I put a flashlight on a stand. You can see here with all the lights turned off that you can see just a little bit of that pop, but it just wasn't enough. And I think if I were to do it again, I would have had that catch light first, just to make sure the eyes are popping regardless of all the other light. And the other thing that was tricky was this fill light on the left side of his face, because not only is it a fill light, you can see the rim here, so it's also a bit of a backlight as well. Again, I would have liked to experiment with this more. I just wasn't getting it, and I was trying different things, and I think I got close. It's not perfect, and again, I'm just not getting enough light on the eye here. So I think if I were to do it again, I would have used a bigger, softer source, and again, kept it slightly behind or maybe a little bit off to the side so that you can get a little bit of that rim, which I think I succeeded at, but I don't think I got quite enough fill in the eye here. But what I ended up settling on for that fill light slash backlight was an LED wand, and I cooled it off to be a little closer to daylight temperature, just because as you can see here, this side of his face is cooler. The light on his face is a lot more soft and more forgiving than what I ended up with. I did use some wax paper for diffusion, so if you're ever in a pickle and lacking diffusion, kitchen wax paper does the job. If you're using LEDs, I would not use this with Fresnels or anything else. It will catch on fire. And so I just wrapped that on the LED wand, and Bob's your uncle. And then for the background sort of water light, essentially what I did was I had a cooking sheet with a mirror on top of it, and then I poured water on top of the mirror, just like an inch of water. And if you swish that around, you get just sort of this moving water lighting effect on the wall. And it actually worked really well and looked similar to what's going on in the movie. And then for the post work, I'm really just going to keep this to Final Cut Pro. I think if I really wanted to do justice to this, I would do it in DaVinci Resolve, but I know a lot of you are Final Cut Pro users. Just wanted to do something simple. I'm not really going to get too into the weeds on the color correction because I don't want this to be a color tutorial. I want this more to be about the lighting. But again, how do you take it from what you shot to the final look? It's still a big, important part of the process. So one thing that I do want to mention is what I shot this on. I used my new Sony FX3, which I absolutely love. I shot in SLOG 3, Cine Gamut 3, which probably makes me seem like a traitor because I've done so many videos on HLG on this channel. Still really like HLG. I think it's great for 8-bit video, and I did all the BTS to this video in 8-bit. But again, the thing that I've always wanted, and you know this from the start, is I wanted a good log format that could sustain flexible color manipulation, and finally SLOG 3 is there with the 10-bit or the raw output. So I'm thrilled with that. I'm thrilled with this camera. I'm loving working with this, and I'm loving the new color science that's closer to the Sony Venice in the Cine Gamut 3. I might be wrong about what that's called. I also have the new Sirui 50mm anamorphic lens that's a 1.6 stretch. Really cool lens. I'd love to do a video on both the camera and the lens at some point. So first things first, I added an adjustment layer that does the de-stretch of the footage, and I scaled it up appropriately to fit the 2:4:1 aspect ratio. And then for this shot, you know, I just wanted sort of a base LUT that I could color grade from. I couldn't use any of my HLG3 LUTs because they're not really meant for SLOG3 footage. I used the Phantom LUT Neutral, which these are great LUTs, as I'm sure all of you guys know. They look like the ARRI Alexa, really wonderful LUTs, very detailed, very precise, very smooth. I like them a lot. So I added that as sort of my base. Then beneath that, I did color correction, and just quick overview of what I'm doing with the color here is bringing down the global exposure just a little bit, lifting the global saturation up a bit, bumping shadows just a little bit, bringing down midtone sat just a little bit, just so the skin's not overly orange, cooling the shot off just a tiny bit. And then after that, I actually applied a print emulation LUT. I did this because Linus Sangren mentioned that the movie was shot on film, but I don't think it was printed to film, so they did a DI. And then he said he applied a LUT that was essentially a film print emulation. So I used one of the Vision Color ones here, 5219 negative FPE, which now that I'm thinking about it, that's not a print emulation. I should have used Kodak 2383, which is what's usually most commonly used. But anyway, this did the job. I did it not at full opacity because I didn't need to. And then it's a little bit easier to see what's going on with the hue saturation curves once I have that final output applied. But for the curves here, I had it sort of in between, like the meat of a sandwich. And what's going on here is basically my blues were too blue. They needed to be a little more teal, and my lights were a little too orange. So I made an adjustment there in the hue versus hue just to get it a little bit closer. And then hue versus sat, I basically bumped up the saturation on my yellows of the lamps and then brought up the red in the skin tones as well. If you look at Daniel Craig's ears, it's just a little bit of a deeper sort of brownish red. And then hue versus luma. The main thing I'm doing here is that the lights were a little too bright, so I just brought down the luma. And again, this is where DaVinci Resolve would really shine, because hue versus luma is absolutely terrible in Final Cut Pro. If I were to push this even further, this would just destroy the image, which it really needs to be pushed further. So that's basically the color grade. And then after that, I did one last step, which was basically to darken the edges. I did a mask, darken the edges, and then sort of desaturate the skin a little bit. And there you go. So anyway, it's not perfect, but I think it's pretty darn close to the look of this scene from No Time to Die, and I'm really happy with the results considering I filmed it in my living room. If you guys like what you saw, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. It would mean the world to me, and I'll be making more videos soon. I'd love to know what you think of this video as well, so feel free to sound off in the comments and be nice. Thanks. Bye.